Keith Richards is a musician, songwriter, singer, and recording producer. He is an original member, guitarist, secondary vocalist, and co-principal songwriter of the Rolling Stones. His songwriting partnership with the band's lead vocalist Mick Jagger is one of the most successful in history. Keith Richards may have mellowed with age, but as anyone who has read his memoir can attest, the iconic Rolling Stones guitarist has raised enough hell to fill several lifetimes. Keith Richards has done some of the funny things you can imagine. In this video, we look back on the wildest and weirdest moments in Richards' 50-plus years of public limelight. Grab your tissue and get ready to smile and laugh up to the end of this video. By the mid-70s, Keith Richards was a drug bust veteran, but this one topped them all and threatened to derail the Rolling Stones at their peak. In February 1977, Canadian cops found roughly an ounce of heroin in Richards' hotel room. Charged with possession for the purpose of trafficking and looking at a potentially lengthy prison term, Richards posted bond and wangled a special visa permitting him to undergo an experimental addiction cure in the U.S. By the time his case came up, in October '78, there were 500 to 600 people outside every time I turned up in court, chanting, "Free Keith, free Keith." It was reported. Keith was found guilty but walked out anyway. While out on bail, he even partied with Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau's frisky young wife Margaret, who was hanging out with the band. Adrenaline is the most amazing thing we have. This was displayed in 1992 when, indeed, his ability to go without sleep is almost beyond belief. He recorded the hit single Before They Make Me Run, from 1978 as Some Girls, in a 5-day studio binge. One engineer would flop under the desk and have a kip, and I'd put the other one in and keep going, he wrote in his memoir, Life. But his actual record is almost twice that long. 9 days without a wink, he bragged. I fell asleep standing up. Eventually I was just putting another cassette back on the shelf, and I was feeling great, and I turned round and fell asleep. We fell against the edge of the speaker. Woke up in a pool of blood. 1967 was the next year when something interesting happened again. Richards purchased Redlands, an estate in Sussex, England, for £20,000 in 1966. A few months later, it became the site of one of the 60s most infamous drug busts, when 20 cops descended on the home in search of illegal substances. Richards, Jagger, and Mary Ann Faithfull, who were all coming down from a day-long acid trip, were ensnared in the raid. There's a knock on the door, I look out the window, and there's this whole lot of dwarves outside, wrote Richards. I'd never been busted before, and I'm still on acid. It was later revealed that the police had been tipped off by a tabloid paper that had been tipped off by Richards' driver. Richards and Jagger were brought up on drug charges and received brief prison sentences that were eventually overturned. Another funny episode ensued in 2007 after Keith Richards' father's death. 5 years after the death of Bertrand Richards, Keith's father, the guitarist once implied he committed an inventive act that brought him closer to the dearly departed. The strangest thing I've tried to snort. My father, Richards reportedly told the UK's New Musical Express in 2007. He was cremated, and I couldn't resist grinding him up with a little bit of cocaine. In response to anyone who might have been offended, Richards said, "My dad wouldn't have cared, he didn't give a shit." Although his manager later said that Richards had made the statement in jest, Keith provided some teasing details in light. As I took the lid off of the box, a fine spray of his ashes blew out onto the table, he wrote. I couldn't just brush him off, so I wiped my finger over it and snorted the residue. I learned to ski when I was a complete junkie, Richards once boasted. In 1972, Richards, exiled from France on drug charges and from Britain for tax reasons, moved to a chalet in Montreux with Anita Pallenberg and their family. Amid all the partying, Richards found time to take up skiing, and those present recalled him as a risk-taker on the slopes. The reason I made it through despite being in exile was because it was all top-quality shit, he said of his drug supply while in Switzerland. You'll do anything to get your hands on it, and if you've got to move across international borders, then you better start figuring it out. 1973 was another time. Richards was courting trouble. Richards was partying at his home on Chain Walk in London's Chelsea neighborhood, with guests that included the great Chicago blues record producer Marshall Chess, blasting reggae records and getting lit. Then the police broke in and turned up heroin, marijuana, Mendrax tablets, a handgun, a rifle, and 110 rounds of ammunition. Faced with 25 charges, Richards got off with the help of his brilliant lawyer Richard Ducan. He was, soon after my case in spite of it, perhaps made chairman of the bar. By the 1950s, Richards was still a troublemaker. As a teenager, Keith spent 2 years in the Boy Scouts. But this brief flirtation with public service ended after he smuggled a couple of bottles of whiskey into a jamboree and found himself engaging in fisticuffs with fellow members of what he called the Beaver Patrol. Soon afterwards, there were a couple of fights that went down between us and some Yorkshire guys, and so I was under suspicion, he once recalled, according to Victor Bockris Keith Richards, the biography. All the fighting was found out after I went to slug one guy but hit the tent pole instead and broke a bone in my hand. A few weeks later, he punched out some recruit and was expelled. Richards has almost died many times, but there's one close call he says is his most spectacular. On December 3, 1965, while playing the last time in front of 5,000 fans at the Memorial Auditorium in Sacramento, California, his guitar touched his microphone stand, a flame shot out, and Richards dropped to the ground, unconscious. Promoter Jeff Hewson thought Richards had been shot. Said attendee Mick Martin, "I literally saw Keith fly into the air backward. We thought he was dead. He was carried out with oxygen tubes and rushed to the hospital." Richards later laughed as he recalled hearing a doctor in the hospital say, "Well, they either wake up or they don't." He was back on stage the next night. The Stones were in top form on their legendary 1975 tour of the Americas. Richards had a supply of prohibited stuff that was cut into lines and hidden amid the amplifiers. Things went fairly smoothly until Richards and his cocaine supplier, on a detour to get some good barbecue, were arrested in Arkansas. But they called in some favors, paid a $162 bail, and were soon back on the road. "I'm a good driver," Richards wrote in Life, recalling a 1976 incident when he fell asleep at the wheel with his 7-year-old son, Marlon, in the back seat and was arrested after a crash. "I mean, nobody is perfect." The guitarist had been driving back from a gig in Knebworth, England, and plowed his Bentley into a tree. Richards was later picked up by law enforcers, found substances in his jacket, later wrote, "At least we didn't hit anybody." This one made me laugh. During their Australian tour in 1973, Richards met a single mom with a pharmaceutical substance connection. So, naturally, he moved in with her for the duration of a layover down under. Living in the suburbs of Melbourne for a week with a mother and child was kind of weird, he recalled in his memoir. "Within 4 or 5 days, I was like a right Australian old man. Sheila, where's my breakfast?" It was like I'd been there forever. And it felt great. According to Keith, he even took care of the baby when mom was at work. By somebody in a suburb in Melbourne who doesn't even know I wiped him when he soiled on himself. In 1972, on a tour stop in Chicago, Richards and saxophonist Bobby Keys were invited to stay at the Playboy Mansion by Hugh Hefner. They nearly burnt it while satisfying their substance addiction. Bobby says, "It's smoky in here," Richards recalled in his memoir. And then a little later there's a thumping at the door, waiters and guys in black suits bringing buckets of water. They get the door open, and we're sitting on the floor, our eyeballs very pinned. The house was saved, but, as Richards notes, Hefner would relocate the Playboy Mansion to Los Angeles. During a break from the Bigger Bang tour, Richards and a small group flew to a private island off Fiji. After an afternoon swimming with Ronnie Wood, he perched himself on a gnarled low tree that was basically a horizontal branch about 7 feet off the ground. As he tried to jump off the tree to go to lunch, he slipped and hit his head on the trunk. Richards didn't feel any serious pain until days later, when he suffered a blinding headache on a boat ride. That night, he had 2 seizures in his sleep, and his wife, Patty, frantically called for medical attention. After enduring an excruciating 4-hour flight to Auckland, New Zealand, he was operated on by neurosurgeon Dr. Andrew Law. "I woke up feeling great," Richards said. "And I said, well, when are you going to start?" Law said, "It's all done, mate." Richards was back on stage in 6 weeks, with Dr. Law, his head man, by his side. Another interesting episode of laughter ensued in 2014. In 2014, while promoting his children's book Giss and Me, The Story of My Granddad and My First Guitar, Richards appeared on Late Night with Jimmy Fallon, where the host asked him about an infamous instance in which rock and roll legend Chuck Berry allegedly punched Richards in the face. "I was back in a dressing room," Richards said. "He went up to collect the money, I think. His guitar was laid out in its case. When Richards picked up the instrument and innocently strummed any chord, Berry came in yelling, 'Nobody touches my guitar,' and promptly slugged Richards in the face. As Richards joked to Fallon, that's one of Chick's biggest hits. The 1989 Steel Wheels tour was the Stones' biggest yet, but Richards still likes things homey. In Toronto in December, the catering setup had recreated an English pub, complete with a jukebox, cricket bats and standard pub food. When Richards arrived late and found out that the shepherd's pie he'd been looking forward to had been dug into, he refused to go on stage until another one was produced. Jagger was furious, but the concert was still delayed until Keith got his special meal. "It's now famous, my rule on the road," he wrote. "Nobody touches the shepherd's pie till I've been in there. Don't bust my crust, baby." During the late 70s, Richards struck up a relationship with a Swedish blonde named Wildest, whom he described in life as incredibly funny, very witty, and a great lay. One night, they were staying in a rented house in Los Angeles' Laurel Canyon, when Wildest woke him in the middle of the night because a fire had broken out in another room. The cause of the fire remains undisclosed, though the guitarist told The Telegraph in 2010 that he'd accidentally set it aflame. "We had a few seconds to jump out of the window," Richards wrote in Light. "I'm dressed in a short t-shirt only, and Lil is naked." The guitarist said his only possession that survived was a chest of drawers containing his passport, his favorite tapes, jewelry, and a gun with 500 rounds of ammunition. One of the first things people loved about Richards was his naughtiness. At a baby shower in the late 70s, Jo asked Richards not to do cocaine in front of her mother. And surprisingly, her request went ignored. After dinner, suddenly Keith declared, "And now for dessert." With that, he pulled out a big bag of coke and slammed it on the table. Mortified, her mother fled the room. After decades' legendary insanity, the only way left for Richards to truly shock people was to settle down. And in 1991, that's exactly what he did, moving with his wife, Patty, and their 2 young daughters from Manhattan to leafy Weston, Connecticut. Richards has no fixed routine. He once said, "I wander about the house, wait for the maids to clean the kitchen, then mess it all up again and do some frying. Patty and I go out once a week. If there's something on in town, take the old lady out for dinner with a bunch of flowers and get the rewards." That is the long story of Keith Richards' funny moments during his illustrious career to date. Which episode was funny to you? Leave your comment in the comment section. We would be happy to sample your thoughts and give this video a like. Subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories.